So I just traversed the great distance to get out of the Stanford bubble and into Palo Alto. I joined a group of strangers sitting in a circle in an office. We're gathered with one unifying purpose: to explore questions surrounding our mortality. We think about things like what we wish our tombstones to read, or how many days we would want to be on life support for. Our gathering does not prescribe to any particular ideology or agenda, and we get to dictate the conversation's direction. We are participants of the Death Cafe movement. Death cafes have spread since 2011 with a grassroots effort of over 5,000 similar and diverse gatherings worldwide. And they emerge at a unique time today when death is increasingly becoming a medicalized experience. Western societies are especially hardwired to be anxious about and in denial of death, making it all the more acceptable to delegate mortality to the medical sphere. Most people today spend the last moments of their lives in hospital beds. Conversations about death are frequently outsourced to the medical professionals. Even language surrounding cancer as this illness that people fight as warriors against implies that death is the ultimate defeat. But what is lost when people trade honest stories of healing for conversations with doctors about next treatments and survival rates? My project hopes to answer, how is the Death Cafe movement uniquely bridging the gaps in our current westernized narrative of a medicalized death? And moreover, how is this movement both responding to current cultural attitudes, but also reshaping those same attitudes and altogether mobilizing a different type of conversation about death? Beyond academic and news sources, I used autoethnography as a method framework for my investigation. So I immersed myself into the world of the local Death Cafe by attending one and interviewing several local organizers and attendees. Though my involvement means I'm potentially more biased, this presentation is a reflection of what I found most meaningful in my project: the simple yet profound stories that I had the privilege of hearing. So we're first going to look at how the Death Cafe movement is responding to the lack of agency with which people today are approaching mortality. Going into the Death Cafe, I'm pretty anxious about launching myself into an existential crisis on top of a chaotic mid-quarter week. But I'm pleasantly surprised by all of the life in this Death Cafe. It's refreshing to consider how this lens of limited time actually encourages me to make full meaning out of the mundane day-to-day. Now, as a result of avoiding conversations about death, people frequently relinquish opportunities to define the narratives and expectations surrounding their deaths. In Being Mortal, physician Atul Gawande actually notes that people instead leave those choices to the medical institutions. The Death Cafe movement is responding to this cultural lack of agency by mobilizing the self-authorship of mortality. People can, in fact, reclaim ownership over certain practical end-of-life issues. Jack Fong's academic review of 15 death cafes across the US revealed that many participants actually create their wills for the first time. My own interviews with local organizers and attendees similarly revealed the breadth of approaches. One regular participant I spoke with told me about how he was so moved by a conversation that his Death Cafe had on environmentally friendly burials that he decided to be buried that way. Another organizer I spoke with, Jim, told me the powerful story of a regular participant who called him one day. "I know we don't know each other very well," she said, "but attending your Death Cafes has meant so much to me. And I was wondering if you would be there with me by my side during my physician-assisted death." I think what's most important about this process of personalizing death is that it's inherently tied to how we approach life. A synthesis of interviews with organizers across the nation revealed that many viewed death as this fundamental truth for how to enjoy life and living in the time that we do have left. Next, I want to look at how the Death Cafe movement is responding to the solitude with which a lot of people think about mortality. After the Death Cafe that I attend, I sit together with one of my close friends for 3 hours, sharing some of the stories that I had heard in that space. For the first time in our 1.5 years of friendship, we speak vulnerably about our fears, hopes, expectations surrounding death. I see our friendship in a way that I've never seen it before. The taboo nature of death anxiety means that when questions of mortality do arise, people grapple with them alone. The Denial of Death, which is a work that formed the basis for contemporary academic views on death, posits that such thoughts are too dark, too deep to bring to the surface. I think for the Death Cafe movement to stay within the confines of cafe walls would render the label of movement pretty ill-fitting. The power of this movement rests in its ability to mobilize a conversation about death even outside to participants' loved ones. Facilitators in the US agree that they hold this common goal of bringing the conversation back home to the dinner table. And one local story in this vein really stuck with me. Regular participant Andrew has been constantly overwhelmed with death all of his life. He was even in charge of his town's pet cemetery as a kid. But each death cafe he attends still brings him new insights, new perspectives, and he was able to share those insights with his dying cousin this summer. Still, everyone I interviewed also expressed really polarizing reactions from friends and family whenever they did bring up death cafe discussions. Many of their significant others refused to get involved with the death thing. How is it that one local pediatrician grappling with her cancer diagnosis couldn't even mention death to her husband or children? It's important to acknowledge that this process of personalizing death is slow, that reshaping cultural attitudes takes time. Finally, I want to address how the Death Cafe movement is breaking down artificial divisions that people have created amongst themselves. So during the Death Cafe, I think what strikes me the most is the unexpected nature of our conglomerate. That I sit beside people I normally otherwise never would have met, and that these same people share with me such intimate pieces of themselves, such as their mother's dying words or their AIDS diagnosis. It occurs to me that there's something beautiful that happens when people gather together. Because mortality is such an inherently personal and intimate experience, it would be a shame to neglect the unique context and history that everyone brings of themselves. But literature actually points towards artificial divisions people create based on their different backgrounds and the different ways that they approach mortality. For example, there's this racial gap of whites being most likely to plan in advance for end-of-life care. The Death Cafe movement is responding with communal empathy. At national and local levels, people are extremely respectful of each other. They take the time to connect by listening and laughing and crying over their inescapable mortality. Everyone that I interviewed expressed that there's paradoxically a lot of laughter in death cafes. The Bay Area context is especially diverse in the age, race, and socioeconomic status of its death cafe participants. But even in embracing our shared humanity, issues of access to death cafes still arise. Many death cafes in the US have predominantly white and baby boomer participants. Devoting time to questions of mortality can be a privilege that not everyone can afford. So we've looked at how the current narrative of a westernized and medicalized death is associated with a couple things, with a lack of agency, solitude, and artificial divisions. And the Death Cafe movement is sort of responding to this narrative by mobilizing a conversation about death in which participants do have control, engage in social dialogue, and connect across different backgrounds. It's a slow and complex process that is still figuring itself out, but cultural attitudes and norms are being reshaped. During the Death Cafe that I attend, we conclude our time together by having everyone go around in a circle to say one word to sort of sum up what we're feeling in that space. Gratitude, empathy, purpose. I want to challenge you to take some time and reflect for yourself. What word, what impression is this presentation leaving you with? And how can you use that to start a conversation with someone you love about mortality and what makes life meaningful? Thank you.